Welcome to Past Bedtime Talks, a series from Past Bedtime Studio where we discuss storytelling, production, a host of related topics, and anything else we find influential in our creative pursuits. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and visit us at pastbedtimestudio.com for more information. I'm your host Shahab, and today I'm with Ben, Jeremy, and special guest Ty Young to talk about fiction and writing in different points of view. Alright, welcome back to the third episode of Past Bedtime Talks. Welcome guys, Jeremy, Ben, and Ty.
Hey.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for coming guys, I appreciate you guys for making time to come here and talk for our kind of monthly conversation we were having it. So Ty, I would like you to talk about yourself and to talk about your personal habits and what do you like about our podcast. Why did you come here? It's a good question, I feel like.
That's a good question.
The first thing up is, why are you here?
I'm here because it seems that we have an appreciation for storytelling in common. And I was an early reader as a kid, and after 30 years, I still am an avid consumer of stories and fiction, especially of all sorts of genres. That's almost a primary interest.
So if I could ask you, what was the first book you read? Would it be...
The first book I read was probably some sort of children's book.
Okay.
Probably a Richard Scarry or Dr. Seuss type thing.
Okay. That's very nice.
Yeah. And
have you listened to our serial podcast, Philip's Apocalypse, recently?
Yes. Yeah. The first full-length episode and the lost episodes as well.
And you enjoyed it, obviously.
Yeah.
And we did all enjoyed it. Thank you, Jeremy, for writing them.
You're welcome.
It's good to listen to these podcasts. Actually, I've been listening to I re-listened almost all the episodes again, and it really got a new viewpoint towards all the episodes.
Nice.
Today, guys, I would like to talk about the genre called fiction, like the idea of creating a fantasy world, which can be anything. And I would like to talk about why you guys think fiction, or do you guys think fiction is something that people need to read, or does it affect us on our personal life?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I prefer fiction personally. I think there's usually probably two camps of people, where one camp is really like documentary, nonfiction based, serious-minded people, and then there's people who really enjoy fiction type stories. I mean, obviously you can appreciate both, but I feel like if it boils down to it, there's usually two camps of people. But I'm very much a fiction person. I like sci-fi and fantasy.
Sci-fi is actually it's really is one of my favorite topics too, like the subgenre of fiction, because like specifically Star Wars. Who doesn't like Star Wars, right? Like it's just a fact already. I agree. Fiction. I feel, in my opinion, fiction genre specifically is a great runaway for me to think out of this world. Sometimes I decide to not think about bombs and wars and terrorisms and these things happening these days. So it's easy getaway for me to get out of this world and think about something else. And I personally recently got into a lot of fantasy fictional books that I've recently read. Specifically Ready Player One, which I hope you guys have seen the movie.
I just saw it.
You just saw it?
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
I kind of liked it. I mean, I didn't think it was great, but I thought it was an enjoyable movie, and I thought it was kind of a neat take on kind of the gaming culture of like that exists today.
Have you read the book first?
No, I haven't read the book.
Okay, so
no,
I'm reading it now.
Okay,
and they've been telling me that the book is way better than the movie.
Usually is the case.
Yeah, that's usually the case for every movie based on the books. But I did enjoy the movie specifically because it was quirky ideas and elements in it. It was really easy to kind of give that nerdiness of ourselves into the real world problems in a way. You know, have you seen the movie?
I did watch it. I was pleasantly surprised. Because a lot of times when movies try and do a Hollywood take on current pop culture, and especially gaming culture, or like subcultures that are less, they may be popular, but they're not intensely popular. They kind of like just do it in broad strokes and do the stereotypes, the really common stuff, and it ends up sort of dating itself and not really reaching the people who are true fans.
Indeed.
And this did a good job of actually kind of meeting in the middle.
Yeah. And it was just like, I mean, Steven Spielberg has a way with just good old-fashioned adventure movies.
And he had rights to every characters that he had in that movie. There were some characters he didn't use from the book because he couldn't.
Right.
I'm not sure exactly what were the characters he couldn't use, but we were lucky that we had Spielberg making that movie, to be honest. Ben, have you seen the Ready Player One?
I haven't, no. I have heard of it a lot, but I haven't made time to see it yet. But about the camps that Jeremy was talking about earlier, I'm definitely the one that has joined both camps, I can say. I was certainly not sold on the fiction at the beginning, and I felt like, what's the point if it doesn't exist? Why should I know? Why should I care? But then after, what got me to switch was you had the previous podcast was about the suspension of disbelief, and it was a major thing for me. I realized that it doesn't need to be real. As long it can still explore, and it has a lot of values, especially making a new world that doesn't exist, coming up with principles, whatever, I don't know, axioms, fundamental rules, canons, as probably they call it in the literature, is just as interesting and can be very challenging because you don't have any external reference. You are building these up. I mean, you definitely have the real world to base stuff, but wherever you divert from the real world, it becomes interesting and challenging simultaneously. Also, as you said, I mean, I don't really use fiction for as a escaping route. I don't really do a lot of escapism, but in fact, that's maybe my problem. Because I need to consider it to be real to enjoy it.
Of course.
I can't escape it. It is stressful. It can be stressful. Not really stressful. It's just still a story, but. At the end, I definitely I enjoyed. I think I'm the in between camps right now, and I have a much bigger appreciation for fiction.
I completely agree. Like, it's good to have some people that, like yourself, to be in the middle, to actually accept realness and fictional aspects of stories. And I feel like that's the easy and interesting or part of compelling stories, accepting it. I remember last episode, if you guys remember, Amir was our friend who came here, and he was the guy who loved realism storylines. It was hard for him to understand fictional aspect of a story. It was kind of difficult for them to accept it, to digest the idea of not real elements of a story. And I feel like that is completely a thing that is subjective, completely right for anyone to not accept their the not real things. It's completely mature, I would not call it, but acceptance on a human side of it. And I feel like if you are a person who doesn't believe on fantasy things, it's completely right of yours. And if someone loves fantasy and love to be part of that life, and cherish that element in and paste that idea in their life, I feel like they're allowed to, and they have the rights to do that. It's really important to talk about accepting and not accepting fiction. Do you guys think that fiction can help us to sometimes create more things, or does it destroy ideas in our mind?
I don't know if fiction's ever destroyed an idea, at least not intentionally. I mean, it's generally either expanding on something that already exists, as in like speculative fiction or fiction that is set in the real world, and then you have fiction that creates from essentially nothing, like high fantasy or science fiction that's, you know, in worlds that don't exist, won't exist, are purely imagination. So if anything, there's always an encouragement to create rather than destroy any sort of ideas when you're going into the realm of fiction. It's always something being added to your mind.
Indeed.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I think especially with something like sci-fi, fiction can really show us what might be possible, or, you know, what paths we could go down that we shouldn't, maybe. Like, you know, something like Blade Runner 2049, which I thought was an amazing movie.
I will have to watch that. That's one of my
Yeah,
watch lists.
it did a really good job of kind of showing us what humanity could become like, you know, having like destroyed all natural life on the earth and just living kind of artificially. It's I think that's what I like about fiction, is it really can show us what the future might hold, or, you know, for better or for worse, really.
But to maybe add to your point of destruction, I don't think. I mean, I'm just trying to be the devil's advocate here, maybe on purpose, but because I don't really think that's the case. But you can become like escapism can become an issue. I think if you are too sold on being indulging in your own imagination. I mean, this might be an old school concern. Parents were always telling us, you know, stuff like this. But I do believe that you can get over, you can buy into it too much, to the point that your world is, you're not seeing the world around you as it is. You're seeing it through the lens of your imagination. Is that a bad thing? I think it makes you less productive. I think it because you're substituting, let's say a positive reward that you were supposed to get from a real event. Now the same thing is just being simulated through imagination, and I think you can maybe certain, let's say, social capacities can diminish if you indulge in something like this too much, and but I don't think it's a huge concern. I think there are a lot bigger things to play into that, you know, and definitely, in my opinion, benefits outweigh the problems. But I personally think I know certain people. Let's say, in my opinion, there are people, and I believe I've met such people that have maybe diminished certain. For me, social interaction is very important, and I think if you substitute that with this, with what everything that goes through inside your mind, is not as productive, and we as a species have thrived because we could communicate. I don't think this is going to be the next apocalypse.
Yeah.
If people watch too much video, I mean, play video games. I don't think that's going to be the case. But at the macro scale, I think it's somewhat of a concern.
I actually somehow agree with your point. I have two perfect examples of whether does fiction affects or damaged our life. One example I had was a long time ago. There was this series in Iran. It was about how the protagonist character of that story dies, and throughout the series or story, and his essence or soul was wandering around. So that idea was kind of fictional, right? And I've after like a couple of time after that series ended, I've read in the news article that two kids playing with each other, a brother and a sister, and the brother said, "Let me die so that my ghost be around you and help you around." And unfortunately, that affected a loss of life. So there is a part of that actually will affect a lot of people. But the positive point of fiction that I think that helped is that on some of the comics that I've read recently, and some of the series that I've watched based on comics, for example, Flash, Arrow, or other supernatural. They added a lot of physics and scientific fact in it. I feel like that, in a way, a lot of writers and creators are trying to use real factors to allow people to say that the fiction is not affecting your life. It's what people decide from it, right? So from what they achieve, from what they receive. Unfortunately, a loss was lost based on two children and an atmosphere, a surrounding that people didn't, like parents didn't sit down and talk with kids like, hey, this is not maybe real, right? But at the same time, it could help to use to develop. I'm talking, my points are completely two separate, I understand that, but what I'm saying is that fiction can be good and bad at the same time. What we do is we need to figure it out how to use it and how to avoid using it in a way. Continuing on our topic about fiction, for writers, it's really hard for them to create a fictional world. It's, for example, for you, Jeremy, it was difficult, in my opinion, not in my opinion, sorry, and I think that it was hard for you to create a world for Phillips, and it was hard to create it. What was the process of that? Like, how is it hard for writers and creators to come up with a world with the new physics, moralities, realities in it, personalities of that world, the characters, these things are completely either based on real world actions or sometimes completely out of your imagination.
Right. Well, I think we were a bit lucky in the fact that we sort of had a bit of a partial skeleton to work with, and that Mike had done previous work in this and had sort of made something that was really interesting, like just at its basic level, like the premise of an apocalyptic world that had been roasted alive by the sun. And so it was really easy to build off of that idea because it was interesting to start with. But I think we didn't really go about building a world per se at the beginning. Like we started small. I think we talked about this in the first episode where we just like had scenarios and we kind of built off of that. And as the story kind of grew, we were slowly like adding meat to the skeleton and building it up into something more substantial and large. And just as we kept doing that, it got easier and easier to keep building onto the story and developing the characters. So I think it was just kind of building blocks, really, stacking one thing on top of the other. And then by the time we finished writing the end of the first season, we had kind of a substantial world to work with. And when I started writing the short stories, like we had such kind of a built up scenario and world that it was like, oh, okay, well now it's easy just to like keep adding other stories into that world because we had something like really nice and something that felt.
For example,
real.
If I could ask you about the 10 cities specifically, right? There are different characters that are actually interacting with each other.
Yes.
Each characters are they have their own personalities, and do you think do they have this personality is based on something that you had in your mind, or you just decided that if this character is acting this way, what is the best reaction to it? You know what I mean? It's kind of an equation to it. Like, for example, if this character is really nosy, what is a good thing to a good character for it to to be against it is an authoritarian character to like defy its nosiness. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like personality traits and stuff.
Yeah, I think with Tent City, first of all, I didn't really think much about that episode. I knew the place and the location. I didn't know any of the characters, but as I just started writing it, I did it in like 2 sittings. It kind of just like spilled out. And I think a lot of it was because the style was very easy for me to work with. It's a third person short story, but you still very much get an insight into the main character. Like his thoughts they just kind of come out in a third person way. So in a way, it's almost like a first-person story. It's really focused on his thoughts and his experience, so it's kind of limited to his perception.
Right.
But he's a very, the main character of Tent City is a very pessimistic character. He's very pessimistic, very like quick-witted, not at all very serious. He's quite he shrugs off stuff with humor, and I thought, it'd be really interesting for someone like that to really come across someone like super serious and like the man he comes into contact with later in the story is just this kind of militaristic, regimented type guy, and they're sort of just total opposites of each other. But all of it was just based around the single idea of a cigarette. Really, that's how the story rounds itself in and out.
It started with all one cigarette.
Yeah, exactly. The last cigarette in the world.
Exactly. No, I what I enjoy about creation of the worlds when it comes to personality traits and for example, Phyllis specifically. Let's talk about. I would like to talk about our main character, Phillips. He, in my opinion, he's an outgoing guy, and he's an open-minded person, and he's a survival. So I would love to see this character with its personal traits to communicate, to interact with other people. I would like to see how would he react with characters that are attacking him, or characters are supporting him, or characters are questioning his actions. These are the things that my curiosity goes to. In specifically, I recently watched a podcast. I'm sorry, I was listening to a specific podcast called Black Tapes.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fictional story about a reporter from a radio station trying to solve a mystery case, a paranormal mystery case called Black Tapes, hence the title. What is the premise of that is about this reporter found a doctor who is who's a debunker of paranormal activities.
Right.
Dr. Richards. I think that I forgot the name. I'm sorry, but his first name is Dr. Richard, and Dr. Richard has this specific case in his library, I would call, or his office. It's called and there are literally tapes which is colored black. So the reporter tries to find the connection between each episode, and every time I listen to that podcast, what it consumes me to what it attracts me to listen to that every episode next and next, is that how a reporter, a curious reporter, tries to, which is nosy person, tries to figure out things that are either not real, and how she react to people. When there were a bunch of episodes that she had to interact with the victims of exorcism, and it was really interesting to hear the voice of the reporter, to be really she was acting or she was more really sympathetic towards the victims, and it was interesting for me to see the difference. And then how Dr. Richard was trying to debunk this idea of exorcism, telling that this is not real, this is fake and everything. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to see the difference between a supporting person rather than a person who's defending that what she believes, right? So it's really interesting to see different character traits.
That's probably the most important part if you intend to make a story more than the world. I think the characters that you intend to follow are going to be key, because you can build the world after and as you go, and as the characters sort of find things out, the reader or the listener or the viewer can find those things out as well. But what's important to stay consistent is how your characters behave, or at least where they're starting from, mm-hmm. what kind of person they are at their core, because that's going to influence how they interact with everything else that you put in that world from the beginning to the end. So in, for example, Philip's Apocalypse, mm-hmm. the premise is fairly simple. It's in the title, it's an apocalypse. So you already assume there are a few other people there are few resources for this person, so you need to find out what kind of person this is, and then once that's established, every new trial, everything that they discover, is going to be colored by that person's traits. It's only if you start to vary that behavior without reason that it starts to fall apart.
Right.
Because it makes the listener, or the viewer, or the reader wonder what's changed their reactions that we don't know about, that hasn't been explained in the story so far. Mm-hmm. And that's really what permits you to make completely fantastic scenarios. Things where like werewolves or vampires,
Yeah.
or an entirely different planet. All that stuff doesn't really matter because your characters take care of addressing those things authentically, like people, even if they're not really people, but like as real beings with consistent personalities and, I guess, realistic behaviors,
Right.
according to the rules that you lay out in their when you construct
Yeah.
their character.
That's very important. What you say, because it's very difficult also to maintain. Usually, you try to explore characters, which means inherently they're going to be in scenarios that are new to them, and so that's when you can make or break them, and you do that consistently. You
Yeah.
polish their characters, but sometimes you write something, and then later on come and visit and realize this doesn't exactly make sense. Why did I think that this character would behave like this?
Right.
Especially keep maintaining the state of their emotion in the author's mind is pretty difficult, because you need to not only remember what they experienced, you need to remember how they reacted to that experience, and you need to aggregate all of their experiences and lessons from the beginning of story, probably even before that, into every single action, which you can. If you do that too much, you can't. Your character cannot progress anymore because it's stuck. There's just too much behind them, and it's like one drop in an ocean. It doesn't change. They shouldn't change a lot, which makes the character maybe too mundane and linear. But at the same time, if anything new changes their experience, you can't really establish them, because they're totally reactionary and they have no memory or recollection of what has happened to them up to now. Mm-hmm. That is pretty difficult, especially. I think rarely characters have only one. Stories only have one character, which means you have to maintain the state of the mind of multiple characters and all of the interplays between them. And I think that's pretty much the most interesting part of any story, and the craft that goes into it is the most intriguing for me.
Yeah, I think I wrote the first episode to Philip's Apocalypse years and years ago. But I think I always imagined the character as like kind of a bit of a happy-go-lucky kid with like a good sense of humor and kind of social butterfly a little bit. But I feel like in the first episode, it almost feels like he's wearing a bit of a shield, like he's had to live in this awful world for so many months and just barely scraping by, and he's keeping this shield in front of him, just to stay alive. But after this kind of, you catch glimpses of him throughout the episode, kind of as the person he used to be after he experiences the wolf. And, it's kind of like, oh, finally a little bit of a break from the awfulness of this place. You kind of catch these little glimpses of the kid he used to be.
And even loneliness. I think that loneliness about Philip is one thing that shield that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. It's actually created. I feel like loneliness is one factor about it.
Yeah.
And when he finds that wolf, it's kind of like you never think about seeing a wild animal and you be like, oh, I'm happy now. I'm happy to see this wild animal. You be like, oh no, I have to run away because they might kill me or something. But it was really intriguing to see a new aspect of thinking about that scenario, that person. So Phillips saying that person is or the creature is really intriguing, and it was one of the factors that I really got curious about the personality of Phillips.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting because it wasn't really explicit in telling you what you're supposed to find out about Philip as he goes through this. It's sort of, you infer it from his behavior, because really that sort of scenario could have gone so many different ways based on, replacing Philip with a different character.
Yeah.
Somebody might have said, a hunter type would have gone, ooh, food, I'm going to kill this animal. Or somebody might have acted, in terror and just run or cowered or something. But Philip had this specific experience that tells you, it's sort of like an example of how they would approach things in general. And it's kind of your first opportunity to see him face something and then deal with it in a real sort of reactive, like really internal kind of way. Like it's true to them. They're not calculating. He's not calculating something. He's not overthinking it. It's just insight into how he approaches things, everything, his life in general, even in a completely foreign circumstance like an apocalypse and seeing a wolf, right? It's not usual, but he approaches it in what you can assume is his usual manner.
Yeah, he's still very much a kid at heart.
I can easily say that. I agree with you, because at the end of it, he was thinking, and I did enjoy his voice. Please tell Michael I like his voice. Thank you. Now, let's move on to, after creating a world of fiction and personality and characters, what does you guys yourselves enjoy the narration of the story? Do you guys like the first-person viewpoint of a storyline, or third-person point of view? Which one does it help you more connected to the story? For example, what I'm trying to say is that you can read a book or listen to a podcast which is narrated by the character or the protagonist itself, right? Or by the narration or the narrator who talks about things happening. Would you guys feel like closer and relate? How can I say? Connect to the story, feel like that thing is happening when the character themselves are talking about it, or someone else is talking about it over it?
That's a really tough one. I will say that despite having read, seen, listened to a lot of stories, when it's done, I don't usually remember what perspective was narrated from, because I've just sort of absorbed the story. But when you actually stop to think about it, it's probably easiest to just do something in like an omniscient third person. That way you can tell the reader everything they need to know in whatever way you see fit, whenever it's convenient. And it really gets difficult to engage somebody if you're doing something entirely in first person, because you're extremely limited in what you can reasonably tell your audience. You're limited by the perspective of your character. So that's an additional challenge that can might make or break the appeal of a given presentation of a story, depending on the skill maybe of the writer.
Yeah, it's really a craft issue.
A big portion of how you tell us which point of view you choose. I think it's how you decide to unfold the plot. How does the plot progresses, and how does it how does it relay information to the audience? I think that's, to me, that might be the biggest part of how you choose your narrator, or how much the narrator sees. When the narrator knows everything, they probably are telling it in chronological sequence of the events. So, but if you're trying to keep something, But that's also might be the creative side of it, right? Sometimes you are seeing everything, but maybe you're being misled by the narrator. Maybe the narrator thinks they know everything, but they don't. Maybe they're recounting an event, a witness type of thing. But so, I think a big portion of it still boils down to how you want the plot to unfold, and the question is in that sense more technical than. What I'm trying to say is maybe it's not completely your choice. You will have to settle with one over another, and in fact, I don't know if it has a lot to how you absorb it, because as Ty was saying, at the end you piece all of the, you piece it out at the end, and is that right? You put the pieces together, right? Okay. You put the pieces together at the end, and you will have an image. It doesn't matter which piece you put at the beginning, how you form the image. I mean, again, that's another claim. I guess it does matter how you form the picture, because that's gonna be the tone, the emotion, and the experiences of the characters. So their personality also comes into play. I personally haven't really experienced either one to be more powerful. It's mostly which one is. To me, it's usually from how I see it is usually chosen by for it to be the most convenient one.
I think when I was writing the Lost episodes, I found a third person limited style was the best in this case, because it's very much both episodes are very much focused on just one character throughout the story, and you really hear everything from their perspective, even though it's third person. But I don't know, for some reason that style really really worked for me, and it was easy to write in that style.
You see, now let me tell you guys the paradox that I'm in right now. So as a reader, as a consumer of audio drama and books and everything and every product and stories, I have conflict on which narrative is easier for me to understand. I enjoy the omniverse, character or the narrator that actually explains everything to me. But at the same time, Ben just pointed out that he has motivations, right? The narrator can actually, kind of
arbitrarily choose
arbitrarily choose one side of the story. It doesn't tell you exactly everything. Sometimes I feel like the first person point of view is most authentic way of telling the story, because what you read and what you hear is exactly what the character is saying, right? I don't think that character has any agenda of hiding any point of view or story or plot from you. It is subjective, and some stories that I've read recently, they're mostly some of them are like a shift of the first person to the third person point of view, and it was interesting because every time the story turned into a third person point of view, I had less clue and less understanding of the sequence of events. I didn't understand some parts of the action or some part of the storyline or the personality of that specific character that the narrator was explaining. And every time the story shifted to the first person point of view, I could read and understand exactly what that character sees. So in a way, I feel like I personally think that first person is not just easier for the writer or the creator, but also is easier for the reader and the consumer to understand what exactly is. But at the same time, it's bad effect, or the negative point of first person is the limitation of the events and storyline that you could understand, because as Ty said, the first person, the character is only seeing a limited view of the story. Nothing is happening behind him, so he doesn't know. Sorry, he or she doesn't know what's happening behind it. So I feel like, I'm confused on which one is the right way. Whereas I prefer the first person subjective point of view, because I feel like related to it and more understanding towards the closer to the writer viewpoint. And I feel like that's again subjective, that everyone can be different way of understanding the story.
I would contend that it varies. It depends heavily on what kind of story you're trying to tell. I've been trying to think. I can't remember if The Bell Jar is actually written in first person or if it just feels like it's written in first person. But it's a story that's about one person's intensely personal journey. And it would feel really weird to have a narrator explaining to you what this person is feeling inside, as opposed to this person explaining what they're feeling inside. Because the whole point of the story is that nobody else knows what they're really feeling, and that nobody else has their point of view. Like the fact that their point of view is so different is the story. Like, that's the point. Whereas you could have something like your standard action fare, or like it's an action story, you know, starts and finishes in one book, one movie, with a lot of moving parts, where if you had everything from the perspective of one person, you might have like really boring parts where nothing is happening that they can see, while things are going on that are going to affect them later on that you can't know about, which kind of like, what's the point if you don't know them? So it's not that you can't use things like foreshadowing or like dramatic irony or even just show you other parts of the story that are happening concurrently. It's a lot more difficult to relay that information with a single viewpoint in a story. So you have to consider it at the outset what kind of story you want to relay, whether it's going to be a big multi-character affair, or if you're really just trying to convey what one person is going through from start to finish, like their progression throughout a series of events.
Yeah, actually, I totally agree with that. It's first person is very limited to chronological progress. I can't think of a story offhand that works with multiple characters in first person. Like, because actually this kind of relates to what you said, Shabi, but in the opposite fashion. I feel like first person stories put you closer to the character, and third person put you closer to the writer.
Right.
So like for third person stories, you have the option of making it feel bigger, and you can go between different characters in different situations, maybe even time jump. You can also in first person, but you're still kind of limited to that one character. But at the same time, you can delve even deeper into their experience than you can in third person. So yeah, I think it really boils down to what kind of story you want to tell. You know, there are certain stories that will, you know, intrinsically work better in first person. And I think a lot of that too is like non-sci-fi type stories, like just of like real kind of daily living journeys that can be really eye-opening from a first person perspective, but at the same time wouldn't be interesting in third person.
I agree.
Yeah.
I feel like, sorry for interrupting, but I feel like even like I don't know if this is a argument against my own point of view, but I remember the movies The Sixth Sense, right? So at the end we found out that the character
Spoiler
is
alert.
a spoiler alert, obviously. Well, come on, it's like
I know.
the year 2000. Right
I still
now,
feel obligated.
I am sorry to whom or who that has not been seen this movie yet. But, spoiler alert again, the character at the end finds out that he was dead at the whole story, right? So even the first person point of view can sometimes be really kind of wrong way of story. Like it can
Intentionally misleading.
exactly intentionally misleading, even though it was not trying to do that. It was the twist plot at the end of this movie, right? Or Shutter Island. That's another good movie. Have you spoiler alert again? God damn it! I'm sorry, but Shutter Island again. At the end, you find out that Leonardo DiCaprio's character.
You realize that the character is not whom they thought they
exactly.
would be.
So once it is for me, I love those two movies. Even though the twist, the plot twist at the end was shocking but enjoyable at the same time. And I think still I enjoy watching the movie on that character's point of view, to know that everything that he believes is right, even though at the end the world is completely different than what he was expecting in the whole story. I just came up with this idea. Sorry, I had to say those things.
No, sure, that actually ties in really neatly, because I was about to say that your first-person perspective stories are going to be predicated on what that character knows and is capable of knowing, in addition to what they actually see. So if you have something written from the first person of a character who's not particularly insightful, that can work in favor of the story, because then the reader might see, quote unquote, what the character is seeing, and understand something that the character does not understand.
Exactly.
So what is seen is written or shown, but the actual understanding or the comprehension, how the character parses that information, can be different from how the reader or viewer does, which can work to great effect. Or it can just be the result also of bad writing too, if the character is missing things, or if the character is seeing things or understanding things in a way that is out of character, which goes back to the character consistency part.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an option, but it's maybe a little bit, I think you said technical earlier, which I think fits.
Yeah, and so that's what you're describing is the author using first person to be able to obscure you from what is real. So to mislead you and obscure what's real. So they are trying to separate plot and story from each other without making you understand it. And as you can see, it can get old pretty fast. If you, in my opinion, if you play too much with the point of view as an active element in the story rather than a passive element, it can trivialize everything. Oh, he wasn't dead. He thought he's dead. Oh, he's dead, but he comes back to life. Like it just like everything's arbitrary.
Yeah, you will lose the attention of the viewer. Or
exactly.
Yeah,
Someone
exactly.
I can't remember on YouTube. Someone was talking about how bringing one of comic Marvel or DC. I can't remember. As you can tell, I'm not really an advocate.
He loves the Marvel, by the way. Go ahead.
He must.
He must, because he's like Superman and Spider-Man at the same time. What? Okay, go ahead.
How when they kill characters, they make death and not potent or not ominous anymore. So it's the same thing. It's very difficult, in my opinion, to mess with something that big and use it actively. I think it's almost what do they call it? A one-time wonder. One person can do it good only once.
Yeah.
No one else can ever use the same trick because it's old. So I think it's pretty audacious to go towards that route, and I think it's a lot of innovation to think that even something as established as point of view can be experimented with. But at the same time, if you are not careful with it, and I personally think you almost don't go that direction. But if you're not careful with it, it can become pretty boring. And so again, back to, I think it's a choice mostly that you make to convey the story rather than for it to be active or a preference really.
And thank you guys for coming to this episode. Thank you, Jeremy, Ben, Ty. And I hope to see you guys on the future. And thank you to our amazing listeners. And have a great day.
Good night.
Right.
Night.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Past Bedtime Talks. Thanks for joining us. Join us next time as we continue our discussion from fiction into the realm of video games. Have a good day and night.